Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Neal Tognazzini about time travel and free will, as well as some non-standard threats to free will from other areas of metaphysics.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Neal Tognazzini, professor of philosophy at Western Washington University. Neal's research focuses mainly on issues in moral psychology and in the metaphysics of free will. He's the co-editor of several projects, including a book called Blame, Its Nature and Its Norms, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. And most recently, a volume called Freedom, Responsibility, and Value, Essays in Honor of John Martin Fisher, published by Routledge last year, that is 2024. Neal has also published many articles and book chapters on free will. He's got one that's going to be of interest today, a chapter on free will and time travel in the Routledge Companion to Free Will, which was published in 2016. And we've asked him to join us to talk about that topic today. So welcome to the show, Neal. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks very much, Taylor. Appreciate that. And thanks both Taylor and Matt for having me on the show. I'm honored to be a part of this project. It's a cool project. I've listened to, I think, every episode since you guys started. Nice. And cool. I love it. So I'm glad to be here. A bit about me. I teach at Western Washington University, which is in Bellingham, Washington, which is just about as far northwest as you can get in the United States, in the continuous continental United States before you get to Canada. I was actually an undergraduate in this department myself, which is pretty cool to get to teach alongside of the professors who taught me. There's still a few of them here from when I was an undergrad, which is cool. I was a bit worried, to be honest, that it might feel weird coming back as a former student, but I taught at the College of William and Mary for a few years first, which I think kind of gave me my own sense of my own independence or something before I came back. And then I ended up coming back to the West Coast because I grew up around here and my family all lives around here. And so does my wife's family. So super happy to have gotten a job back at Western. My interest in free will, let's see, it was one of my current colleagues, actually, Francis Howard Snyder, who taught the first class that I took as an undergrad, where I really got introduced to these topics. The class she was teaching that quarter was about freedom and foreknowledge. And it was also the first time that I had read Frankfurt's paper on PAP. And I remember just being super fascinated by that class. And then after that class ended, I remember going to the university library and checking out Peter Van Inwagen's book, An Essay on Free Will, and reading it. And I think that was probably the first philosophy book that I ever kind of read, not for a class, just for quote unquote fun. And I was just hooked. So that kind of took me into my grad school career. I went to grad school at UC Riverside to study with John Fisher and Gary Watson, who was still there at the time. And eventually my interests kind of shifted from straight up metaphysics of free will to moral responsibility. And eventually, thanks to the influence of Colleen McNamara, who's also at UC Riverside, I became interested in the nature and ethics of blame, which is the subject of that collection of essays that you mentioned. Since then, I guess my scholarly work has gone more toward philosophy of the emotions and more general issues in moral psychology, including regret and envy and judgmentalism. Most recently, I've been working on a paper on what it means to hold a grudge, which I'm hoping it will see the light of day here pretty soon. But anyway, questions about free will have always been my first love in philosophy. So my interest in those has endured.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, very cool. Since we're going to be talking about time travel and whether it poses any threat to free will, perhaps it's best to start with a case of time travel. So do you have a favorite, or at least one that's helpful for setting up the discussion on time travel and free will?
Yeah, there's so many great ones. It's honestly hard to choose. Let me say, I don't consider myself a especially sophisticated aficionado of time travel stories. I'm not actually a very big fan of science fiction in general. It's not typically what I seek out. So I don't know. My favorites here are probably a bit lowbrow for people who are into sci-fi. One that I really like is the novel The Time Traveler's Wife, which I read a long time ago, but I think it spins the time travel premise in a really interesting way because it's a disease that he has, that he inadvertently travels through time. He's not doing it on purpose, and it causes all sorts of problems for his romantic relationships. And anyway, I thought that book was really good, and also does explicitly talk a bit about free will and his experience of his own free will. So it's worth checking out if anybody hasn't read that. But I think for our discussion, maybe a better example would be the one that comes from the Harry Potter book series, specifically book 3, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I'm a big Harry Potter fan anyway, but I got to say, I was especially impressed with the way that the time travel story was told in that book. So, okay, so I'll try to tell it quickly. Let me give you a bit of background in case you don't know the Harry Potter.
Should we give a spoiler alert?
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Is it?
It's book 3, so it's not it's not giving away the whole series,
right?
And it's really just one scene in the book, but. All right, so here's the background. Harry Potter, he's a wizard. He's at school learning how to use magic, but he's also constantly finding himself in life-threatening situations because there's a bunch of powerful dark wizards who want him dead for a variety of complicated reasons. So in this book, this is book 3, Prisoner of Azkaban, the school is being guarded by these magical dark creatures. I guess they're not dark. Well, maybe they are dark. Anyway, they're creatures called the Dementors, and they feed on human souls. Okay, so toward the end of the book, Harry finds himself in a situation where he's attacked by these Dementors, and he's about to get his soul sucked out when all of a sudden someone emerges from the forest near him and casts a protective spell to save his life. Now, he doesn't realize it at the time, but it turns out, here's the spoiler, that the person who emerges from the forest to save his life is him. A slightly older version of himself, a time traveling version of himself.
Yep.
He doesn't know it at the time, but later on he figures it out because he and his best friend Hermione, they travel back through time using this magical device called a time turner to accomplish a different task. They don't know that they're going back to save Harry's life, but while they're back in the past, they're in the forest watching Harry's younger self getting attacked by the Dementors, and he realizes, that is, Harry's older self realizes in that moment that he is the one who saved himself. And so he steps out of the forest and he casts this protective spell. Just as the Dementors are about to suck out his soul, that is, the soul of his younger self who's across the way. So anyway, the way the story unfolds, it's thanks to time travel that Harry is able to save his own life. And what happens is he experiences this same set of events, but he experiences them from 2 different perspectives. His first experience is of being the person who's being attacked. And his second experience is of being the person who is repelling the attackers, but it's not as though 2 different things happen. There's only one thing that happens. He's attacked, but then he's saved. It's just that Harry gets to experience it twice. Once as the younger version of himself, once as the older version of himself. So it's one of these time travel stories that's got a loop, a life that loops back onto itself. And those are the stories that I find the most fascinating.
Yeah.
They're also the ones that can be really difficult to make sense of because they seem like they involve these weird causal loops, and that makes some good starting points for talking about philosophy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's one of my favorites too. And I might be a time travel story aficionado, and I do like science fiction. So
nice. Yeah, I think you are.
Kind of obsess over them. Okay, so time travel stories, even if people don't know Harry Potter, they probably can think of something similar from some movie or book. But there's quite a bit of variety among them. So what are some of the basic models of time travel and that are used in these kinds of stories? And then do all or only some of them seem to pose a threat to free will?
Yeah, great question. I guess, so let me start by saying something about like the how-tos of time travel. And then maybe we can talk about the philosophical models that are like what it would mean for the nature of time or for the nature of ourselves. So, okay. So yeah, just cut me off if I'm going on too long. But let me start by saying, I guess that there's a boring sense in which we all are time travelers. We're all traveling toward the future at a rate of 1 second per second. By the same token, we're all like space travelers as well, because our planet is constantly in motion around the sun and we're just kind of along for the ride. So we're traveling through space. We're also traveling through time. Neither of those is really an interesting sense of travel.
Right.
Part of what we're imagining when we imagine traveling through time is we get to select our destination, at least within certain like technological constraints. And we also imagine that the distance we travel is different than the amount of time it takes us to get there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want my trip 100 years into the future to take 100 years. That's boring. I want the world when I arrive to be more radically at odds with like how much I've aged myself.
Right.
So there's questions from physics about how this would work or whether it makes sense given the laws of nature. And I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is that there's lots of ways time travel in that sense could work, even within the constraints of the physical laws of our universe. So one of the things that we learned from Einstein is that time passes more slowly for people who are either moving very, very fast relative to the surroundings or people who are very close to a strong gravitational field. Super weird, but super fascinating.
Right.
So with that in mind, here's one really straightforward way to become a time traveler. Suppose you want to visit the Earth 100 years from now, but you don't want to be 100 years older. Here's what you do. You get into a spaceship and travel far away from the Earth at a very high speed, then turn around and come back at that very high speed. Depending on how far you go and how fast you travel, you can make it so that when you come back, the Earth will be 100 years older, but you will only be maybe 10 years older.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that counts like as a time travel story probably depends on what you want from a time travel story.
Yeah,
so
right.
I think it's okay to feel a bit let down by that story. Also, that's a case of time travel to the future, which doesn't really raise the same sorts of questions as about free will, I think, as time travel stories to the past, because it's time travel to the past that involves you interacting with past versions of yourself or your own ancestors, where who we are and what we do kind of depends on what has happened in the past. And so it seems like it's only when we travel to the past that worries about meddling arise. And those are the worries that puzzle philosophers.
Right.
Anyway, so just assume that, my understanding is that there are some scientific understandings of time travel according to which we can travel to the past too, but forget about the how-to, like how we would accomplish it. Just suppose we could accomplish it. What would it mean for the nature of time? What would it mean for the time traveler for us to travel to the past? So the philosophical models here, I think we can divide them up into two camps. One camp is time travel that involves a single timeline with a single set of events. The other camp involves multiple timelines with multiple sets of very similar but distinct events.
Mm-hmm.
So the Harry Potter story is a single timeline time travel story. There's only one set of events involved. It's just that Harry ends up with two different perspectives on the very same set of events. So when he's younger, he doesn't realize that his older self was already there, as it were, waiting to cast the protective spell, but his older self was already there. He just didn't realize it. And when later in the story he goes back in time and saves himself, he's not changing the past, as we often think happens in time travel stories. That's not what's happening in this story. He's not changing the past. Instead, he's just experiencing the past that he already experienced. He's just experiencing it from a different vantage point, this time from the point of view of the person who's in the forest, who's casting the protective spell. So on the single timeline model, someone who travels to their own past gets to have a different point of view on that past.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't make the past different than it already was.
Right.
Now, one of the interesting things about the Harry Potter story is that he and Hermione actually go back in time thinking that they can change the past, like that's their intentions.
Right.
But as it turns out, they just end up doing the things that, in some sense, they already did. They just don't realize that they're not changing anything.
Right.
So that's the single timeline time travel story.
Mm-hmm.
The contrast is with the other camp, which are multiple timeline time travel stories. And I think there's two different versions of the multiple timelines model. So one version we might call the branching timeline model, according to which the time traveler arrives in the past, but it's not their own past. It's an alternative past timeline. It's a way things could have gone, but didn't actually go. So this is one way to interpret the movie Back to the Future. Mm-hmm. So in that movie, there are multiple timelines. There's the first time around when Marty McFly didn't exist in 1955 when his parents met. And then his mother gives birth to him. Then in 1985, he finds himself in a time machine headed back to the year 1955. And when he arrives, well, now he's there. He wasn't there the first time around, but now he is there in 1955. And he starts messing things up. And that's the source of the kind of the plot of the movie. But his being in 1955 only messes things up because he wasn't there the first time around. And so that means he isn't interacting with the very same 1955 as the one that led to his existence in the first place. Instead, he somehow found himself in an alternative timeline, like a different version of 1955 that now includes him as a time traveler. So, how that actually works, I'm not sure, but it's something. I think the idea is when you travel to the past, somehow that causes the past to sprout a branch or something that leads off into a different sequence of events than the ones that are on the original timeline. Now, it's a good question whether that actually counts as time traveling. Instead, it kind of seems like it counts as like hopping to a different possible world, right? Maybe like world hopping instead of time traveling, where you end up in a alternative sequence of events where the people and events there are like qualitative duplicates of the ones that were in the original timeline. But it's hard to see how it should count as his own past. It's like seems like a different past.
Yeah.
Also, in Back to the Future, the movie ends up kind of incoherently suggesting that Marty's presence in the past somehow threatens his own existence, since he almost prevents his parents from getting together. But if he's visiting an alternative 1955, then nothing he does there should threaten his own existence, since he was born as a result of events that happened in the original 1955. Let me take the opportunity here to plug a forthcoming paper co-authored by somebody you might know, great philosopher named Taylor Sear. Who has co-authored this paper with Grace Scott, which is a discussion of some of the worries of the Back to the Future.
Oh, thanks, Neal.
Plotline. Yeah, it's a cool paper. Forthcoming in a volume on Back to the Future and philosophy, right?
And philosophy, yeah. I'm excited for that volume.
Yeah, that'll be fun. So that's one of the multiple timelines models, the branching timeline. There's another multiple timelines model that's called the hypertime model. Things get super weird here, but I'll try to say it briefly. So on this model, the idea is that there can be successive timelines, one after the other, and each timeline contains a different set of events. So, but I just said multiple timelines in succession, one after the other, which is a temporal idea. So it's a way of talking about time. So on the hypertime model, what we actually have are two different dimensions of time. There's the past, present, and future of ordinary time as we know it. But what events are contained in the past, present, future sequence might change as hypertime passes, as the second dimension of time passes. So say I'm about to get into a time machine and travel to the past, but I haven't got in yet. At this moment, that is, at this moment of hypertime, my past does not contain me getting out of a time machine. But then what I do next, and also what I do hyper next, that is at the next moment of hypertime, is I activate the time machine. And now, hyper now, that is, my past does contain me getting out of a time machine. And this is not a contradiction because the past without me was relative to a previous moment of hypertime, whereas the past I arrive at is relative to a different moment of hypertime. So the idea is you can only really specify somebody's true temporal location by giving both like what year they're in and also what year, that is which year they're in, right? So Marty's in 1955, for example, but he's in the 1955 relative to one moment of hypertime, whereas the 1955 is relative to a previous moment of hypertime, he wasn't there. So you still get multiple timelines. It's just that the multiple timelines are in succession rather than kind of existing together. I almost said simultaneously, but that's a word which doesn't
that's tricky
work here. Anyway, so those are the three models: the one single timeline, and then there's two multiple timeline models.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to worries about free will, I think the single timeline model is the one we should focus on.
Mm-hmm.
If you got multiple timelines and as a result of that, multiple sets of events, and each of them have their own distinct people in them, then it seems like time travelers can just do whatever they want. They can just act as they please. It's just like traveling to a different place with different people in it. And so it doesn't seem like that raises any distinctive worries about free will. Maybe there's worries about determinism in that world, just like there is in this world, but that's not a worry about time travel specifically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Harry Potter, the question is, well, he's back in his own past, and it's the very same version of him. It's not like a different version of him or Hermione or the Dementors. And so the question is, well, at least one big question is, when he and Hermione are there deciding whether to go back in time, Dumbledore, their benevolent headmaster, is encouraging them to go back in time. When they're there considering it, and we know as readers that Harry has already been saved by a time-traveling version of himself, the good question is, well, are they free to refuse?
Mm-hmm.
Could they, if they wanted to, have stayed in the present?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's keep going down that line of thought. So how would you spell out the argument that the backward time traveler lacks free will, at least with respect to some of their actions?
Yeah. I think it's actually fairly straightforward. Maybe people can kind of feel it already, but one really easy way to see the worry is to think about the puzzle that's usually called the grandfather paradox, which I know has come up on the show before in your conversation with Andrew Law. I think you talked about this a bit, which was a great episode. I encourage people to go listen to that episode with Andrew Law. All right, but the grandfather paradox I think is relevant here too. So let me just recap it, and then we can see how the argument falls out of that. So one cool thing about time travel, I think, is that you could go back and see what your parents and grandparents were like when they were kids. I would love to be able to do that with my own parents and grandparents. But philosophers are perverse. They don't focus on what's cool about time travel. They focus on what's weird about it. So here's the grandfather paradox question. What if you traveled back in time and killed your own grandfather? Specifically before your grandfather had any kids. And so before your parents were born, and so before you were born. If we can travel to the past, if time travel to the past is possible, it seems like you'd be in the position to do that. Somebody would be in a position to go back and kill their own grandfather. But also, if you think about it for a second, you realize, well, there's no way that could happen, because if your grandfather had died before he had any kids, then one of your parents wouldn't have been born, which means that you wouldn't have been born. But if you hadn't been born, then you wouldn't have been around in the first place to travel back in time to kill your grandfather. So it looks like the possibility of time travel to the past leads to a contradiction. If it's possible, then you could go back and kill your grandfather before he had kids. But if you did that, you wouldn't have ever existed to go back and kill your grandfather before he had kids. So something like, if you were to kill him, then you wouldn't have killed him. The details matter here, but that's kind of the basic idea.
Yeah.
Now, that's meant to be the beginning of an argument against the possibility of time travel to the past, that it leads to contradictions, so it's not possible. But for our purposes, I think we can just focus on one part of the paradox, which is the line of reasoning that seems to lead to the conclusion that even if you were back in time with murderous intentions, you wouldn't be able to pull it off, since your very existence guarantees that you'll fail. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one way to see the worry that time travel poses to the threat of the free will, to threaten the free will of the time traveler. Your very life depends on stuff in the past that you are currently visiting. And there seem to be certain things that we tend to think are usually in our power to do, like pulling a trigger, for example. But the time traveler can't do it, since the fact he's there in the first place guarantees that he won't do anything that leads to his non-existence. Mm-hmm. It might be useful to compare this threat to other more familiar threats against free will. So here's one way to think about it. Arguments against free will, I think, are all attempts to justify an inference from the claim that somebody won't do something to the claim that they can't do it. So if you're a fatalist, you think the fact that it's true that you won't do something means that you can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're worried about determinism, then you're worried that if it's determined that you won't do something, then it follows that you can't do it. If you're worried about God's foreknowledge, then you're worried that if it's a fact that an essentially omniscient God foreknows that you won't do something, then it follows that you can't do something. And those are the interesting moves. That's where the substantive philosophical debate comes, is in the move from won't to can't.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, same thing's happening here. It's just that it applies locally, as it were,
Right.
in a very specific context with a very specific person. But still, it seems like certain facts about them, the fact that their existence depends on the continued existence of the person who they are currently intending to kill, those facts seem to entail that they won't kill their grandfather. And so it also feels like it leads us to infer that they can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a helpful way of putting it. And that reminds me of the way that David Lewis talks about the grandfather paradox in his classic paper from the 70s, Paradoxes of Time Travel. Probably some of our listeners will be familiar with that from if they're new to the free will debate, if they've taken a philosophy course where time travel came up. But he considers these issues, and then he sort of responds to the grandfather paradox by saying that backward time travelers could do things such as kill their grandfathers before their grandfathers have fathered any children, even though those time travelers won't do those things. Could you say a little bit more about Lewis's response in that paper and what you make of it?
Yeah, Lewis's view has been super influential here, and it's worth thinking. It's worth thinking about, I think. So what Lewis asks us to do is think really carefully about what we are saying when we say that someone can do something.
Right.
And his proposal is that what that means, or what we're saying when we say that, depends on context. So this is true for a lot of words, like the word I, for example, the first person pronoun. If I were to say I'm one of the co-hosts of the Free Will Show, that would be false. Mm-hmm. But if one of you were to say I am, quote, I am one of the co-hosts of the Free Will Show, that would be true. Mm-hmm. We've said this. We've said a sentence using the same words, but we've said different things, and one of them is true and one of them is false because the word I changes depending on context. Mm-hmm. So Lewis thinks that the word can is kind of like that. It changes depending on contexts. So his example, which I think is worth using because it's hard to improve upon, is the sentence, quote, I can speak Finnish. That is one of the two official languages of Finland, Finnish. So he says, like, even if we hold fixed who is saying the sentence, it has the word I in it, right? But forget that for a second. Mm-hmm. Hold fixed that it's the same person saying the sentence. That sentence will still come out true in some contexts, but false in other contexts. So just suppose I'm the one saying I can speak Finnish. Mm-hmm. If we're in a context where what we're talking about, like the broader conversational context, is about the anatomical structures that are required to speak human languages, mm-hmm. and maybe I'm trying to point out that I, unlike other primates, have those anatomical structures, then it's going to be true in that context to say, well, I can speak Finnish, whereas other primates can't. But if we're in a context where you're planning a trip to Finland and you're wondering if I can come along to help be your guide in the country, it would be false for me to say that I can speak Finnish because I've never studied Finnish.
Right.
So in this case, you might think of it like this: I've got the hardware for speaking Finnish, so I can speak Finnish, whereas other primates can't because they don't have the requisite hardware. But I don't have the software necessary for speaking Finnish, right. So I can't speak Finnish, unlike other people who have actually studied the language. Mm-hmm. Both of those can be true without contradiction because each is true in a different context. Mm-hmm. So that's the way the word can works for Lewis. And he thinks we can say something similar about the abilities of time travelers. So if you imagine someone traveling back to their own grandfather's childhood, then at first you might be inclined to say, well, yeah, a time traveler can kill his own grandfather because there he is. He's ready to go. What's going to stop him? Mm-hmm. But then on further reflection, we're inclined to say, wait, no, the time traveler can't kill his own grandfather because if he did, that would seem to lead this contradiction that someone who was never born, nevertheless was born and found a way to travel back through time to kill his own grandfather. And Lewis's thought is those are both right. That is, both of those impulses are right. It's just that each sentence is true relative to a different context. When we first think, hey, what's stopping him? He knows how to pull a trigger, for example. He's there. It's not like grandfather's behind a wall or something. In that context, we're thinking primarily about whether, things like whether the time traveler knows where grandfather is, whether he's got access to a weapon, whether grandfather is unsuspecting, or whether grandfather doesn't have bodyguards around him, right? All that stuff. Mm-hmm. In that context, if those are the salient facts, then time traveler can kill their own grandfather. But then we remind ourselves that this is a time travel story. It's a time traveler intending to kill their own grandfather. In that case, the context shifts. And it now includes this additional fact, which is we know that the time traveler won't kill their grandfather. That's just not how this is going to go down. And we know that because otherwise there wouldn't be a time traveler there in the first place. So in this context, which is a different context, Lewis says, it's true to say the time traveler can't kill their grandfather. Again, both things are true, but relative to different contexts. Mm-hmm. The time traveler has the know-how, the opportunity, therefore can, unlike people who aren't close by and don't have access to a weapon. But we know that grandfather doesn't die in this scene. So when that fact is in the front of our minds, it's true to say that time traveler can't kill his grandfather.
Right. So no contradiction.
No contradiction, right? Both things are true. They're each true relative to their own context. As for what to make of this solution, I guess I think there's two questions here. I'm sure there's a million questions, but here's two that are relevant to us. One is whether it provides a satisfying resolution to the grandfather paradox, which is meant to be a challenge to the possibility of time travel to the past. Right. I guess I think it does, or at least as a resolution to the grandfather paradox, I think his solution is great. And that is the problem, as I understand it, he was trying to address in his original paper. As a defense of the claim that time travelers to the past have free will, though, I'm less convinced. So I agree. I just think Lewis is right, that there's some sense of the word can, according to which the time traveler can kill their own grandfather. Mm-hmm. But when people are worried about free will, they're not just worried about like physical capabilities or know-how, or the things that are relevant to that context in which we say the time traveler can kill their grandfather. When they're worried about free will, it seems to involve a broader context. So one of your former guests, Kadri Vivlin, has several papers on this where she's responding to Lewis's view. And her proposal is that if you would fail to do something, no matter what you tried, then you can't do it. And that's the sense of can that's relevant to discussions about free will. Mm-hmm. And I guess that seems like a plausible idea to me. Ordinarily, we think if you can do something, then there's at least some chance that you'll succeed if you were to try to do it. But this is not the way the time traveler case works. That is, no matter what the time traveler tries, they're going to fail to kill their grandfather. So if we accept Vivlin's idea that what's required for an ability in the sense at stake when we're talking about free will is that they might succeed no matter what they tried, or had they tried, they might succeed, then the time traveler isn't free to kill their grandfather because that doesn't apply to them. Mm-hmm. And same thing is true for Harry Potter, right? When he's considering whether to travel back to the past, we already know that he will, since otherwise he wouldn't have been there to save himself from the Dementors, which means he wouldn't have been alive at this moment to even have a decision to make. So if we're wondering whether he can opt to stay in the present, whether he can refrain from traveling back in time, it seems like we have to say no. After all, no matter what he tried, he would fail to stay in the present. And in this case, actually, he's not even a time traveler yet.
Right.
So it seems like this worry applies even to people who aren't yet time travelers, so long as they have been. I mean, it's tricky because he is and he isn't a time traveler already. Right? The past already contains his time traveling self. Mm-hmm. But at the moment of his decision, he hasn't had the time traveling experiences from his own point of view. So the threat to free will exists even with respect to decisions made while the person who will become a time traveler is not currently time traveling.
Right.
So anyway, I guess, in summary, I guess I think Lewis's solution is really elegant as a solution to the grandfather paradox, but I don't think it gets us out of the worry about free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess denying the freedom of time travel is also a fine response to the grandfather paradox. I mean, if you're just denying that in the relevant sense, that the time traveler can kill their grandfather, you don't get the apparent contradiction.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, this is what's interesting, I think, about the Lewis-Vivelin debate is, right, mm-hmm. Lewis thinks can, yes, Vivelin thinks can't, but they both are able to resolve the grandfather paradox either way because there's no contradiction.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's just set aside time travel for a moment. Some people might worry that certain views about the nature of time itself might pose a threat to free will. One such view, sometimes called eternalism or the block universe view, says that all times, including future times, exist. So could you explain this view about time and say whether you think it's compatible with free will?
This might be tricky to do without diagrams.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me give it a shot. Okay, so here's a really natural way of thinking about time, especially as it relates to questions about free will. One natural way of thinking about time is to imagine a fundamental asymmetry between past and future. The past, over and done with, somehow already a permanent part of reality. The future doesn't yet exist. It's something we get to help create through our choices.
Yeah.
Or maybe another way to put it is the past contains this huge list of unchangeable facts, but there just aren't any facts at all about the future. There's no list, at least not facts about what human beings are going to do with their free will. Instead, what happens is we pull certain facts out of the bucket of possibility, and then we make them true when we make our free choices. That's a really natural picture, I think. And if you were working with that picture of how time has to look in order for us to have free will, then it can be really disconcerting to realize that this is not the way most physicists think about time. So if you read a pop physics book on Einstein's theory of relativity, which we talked a little bit about before, but one of the things that seems to suggest is a completely different model of time, according to which, from the point of view of the entire universe, so to speak, there's no such thing as the past or the future, or even what is happening right now. There's only past relative to an observer. And that means there'll be different pasts and different futures for different observers who are at motion relative to each other. Now, there's a lot of details that I don't know because that's beyond my pay grade expertise. But my understanding anyway is that one model of time that we can build to accommodate the theory of relativity with its denial of an absolute notion of simultaneity is a picture according to which the entire universe, like all three dimensions of space and the dimension of time, are all together as like a big four-dimensional block. And inside the block is every physical object that exists now, from our perspective, that's ever existed and that will ever exist. Now, strictly speaking, on this view, there's no like absolute past or present or future. There's just this big container. And inside the container is all of physical reality and all the complicated relations that exist or obtain between all the things that are in the container. But everything in the container is just as real as everything else in the container. It's just that we ourselves can only have a human perspective on the container, which is what gives us our sense that we're somehow in something called the present and time is somehow passing. But if you were to be able to get outside of the entire four-dimensional spatiotemporal universe on this picture, if you had like a God's eye perspective on the universe, the whole spatiotemporal universe, from the Big Bang to whatever's going to happen at the end of time, the Big Crunch or whatever, it's all there. You can just see it all. Something like that is the block universe, or what's sometimes called the eternalist model of time. A lot, especially when I introduce this model to my students, a lot of them are immediately worried about free will. And I think if I'm trying to articulate what the worry is here, I think it's something like the worry from logical fatalism, although it has like an added punch to it. So the fatalist worries that because there are some future tense statements about what I will do that are now true, then that implies that I can't do anything other than what those future tense statements say I will do.
Mm-hmm.
The block universe worry, or the eternalist worry, I think is something similar. It's that some future version of me exists out there in the space-time manifold. It doesn't exist now, but that's because only what exists now exists now. It exists out in the future, but it's still real. It's equally real as the things that exist now. And so in some sense, like what I will do is already locked in to this big block universe. And so, well, I even use the word locked, right? And that feels like a threat to free will. If you're locked in somewhere, you can't do anything. So I think that's the view, and I think that's the worry.
Mm-hmm.
Should we be worried? I guess I don't think so myself. Which is not to say it's obvious, but I think I'm not that worried about it. For one thing, the block universe model itself doesn't imply that determinism is true. I think that those two things get conflated a lot.
Right.
And to be clear, there might be an argument for the conclusion that if the block universe is the right model of time, then determinism has to be true in order to make sense of that block model. But that's going to take an argument. It just doesn't follow from the model itself. All the block universe model says is that the events and objects that are in the future relative to me are real, that they exist. It doesn't say anything about whether they're necessitated or whether they're causally determined. As far as I can tell, you can be a libertarian about free will and accept the block universe model, as long as you think that there can be facts about what will happen without those facts being determined. And I guess I do think that. So that's one potential source of the worry that I think we can take away. I guess the other thing I would say is something similar to what David Lewis says in his response to the fatalist, I think applies here too. So David Lewis's response to the fatalist is to say, the fatalist is tricked because sometimes irrelevant facts about the future masquerade as relevant facts about the past, is the way he puts it. So if we say, for example, it's true even now that I will perform a certain action tomorrow, that makes it seem like the fact about tomorrow is actually about now, because I've just said it's true even now. Oh, it's also, by the way, true yesterday that I will perform a certain action tomorrow. And now it's all of a sudden seems like a fact about yesterday. And since we tend to think the past is fixed and out of our control, it makes it seem like this fact about tomorrow is actually a fact about yesterday. And so it's fixed and out of my control. I think something similar is happening when it comes to the block universe idea. We can say future events and objects are real even now, right? And that makes it seem like those future events and objects are somehow part of the fixed past.
Yeah.
But I guess there's a subtle distinction here, which is it is true now that those objects are real, but it's not true that those objects are real now. Whatever exactly that would mean. They're in their proper place. They're out in the future. And moreover, they bear exactly the same sort of relationship to our decisions as we would want them to, which is they depend on our decisions and not vice versa.
Yeah. Well, in another project of yours, one that you've co-authored with Andrew Law, who you mentioned earlier, a paper called Free Will and Two Local Determinisms, which was published in Erkenntnis in 2019. The two of you consider two other non-standard threats to free will. Could you talk about those two local determinisms? I know that's a lot to talk about kind of briefly with one question here, but maybe say what you think, if any, what threat they pose to free will.
Yeah, so if you thought we were already talking about some far out metaphysics, buckle up. Okay, so yeah, let me say first of all, I guess, that the reason why I've been calling time travel a local threat, quote unquote, local threat to free will, is it's not based on global facts about the global structure of the universe, like determinism or God's foreknowledge, which isn't about the structure of the physical universe, but it's global in a similar way. It applies to everything at all times. So you can also find localized pockets of necessitation or entailment that seem to cause trouble for free will, like the time traveler case. So in this paper I wrote with Andrew Law, good friend, great philosopher, also a fellow Pacific Northwesterner, by the way.
Nice.
So in that paper, we consider two other local threats to free will that have been raised by one of my other colleagues, Hud Hudson, who is one of the smartest and most creative philosophers I know. I'm going to try to avoid the details, but if you're interested in following up on this, Hudd's got 2 books where he lays these out. One of them is called A Materialist Metaphysics of the Human Person, and the other is called The Metaphysics of Hyperspace. And they're both just chock full of hardcore, really fascinating metaphysical claims and arguments and puzzles. Okay, so the first threat is based on a puzzle about the composition of material objects. That is a puzzle about how human beings specifically are related to the fundamental physical elements that they're composed of. So each of us is composed of a vast number of atoms. I mean, other things too, but just focus on the atoms. I Googled it, something like 7 billion atoms per human being. Depends on how big you are, I assume. Somehow all those atoms get together. They interact in just the right way to make a human being. All right, now just think about all of those atoms that make you up, all 7 billion, except one. So the collection of all those atoms that make you up right now, with the exception of, say, one atom that's near the end of your left pinky finger. So take that one away in your imagination. It's still there, but we're just going to focus on all the rest except for that one. Here's the thought. If the first group of atoms, the 7 billion, if those somehow manage to compose a human being, then the second group, the very slightly smaller group, the one that includes all of them except for the one that's near the very end of your left pinky finger, that seems like it also composes a human being. It seems like it's got everything that it would take to be a human being. It would be a very similar human being to you. It overlaps you almost entirely. It just has like a slightly shorter pinky finger than you do. So it looks like we've got reason to think there's actually 2 people where you are right now. There's you, and there's also the shorter left pinky person. But there's nothing special about that atom. So we could have picked any of the other billions of atoms that make you up and just subtracted those from our imagination. So it looks like actually there's this same reasoning suggests that there's billions of people where you are right now. I mean, at the very least, billions. So this is called the problem of the many. And you have to take some basic assumptions about how composition works, how complex material objects are related to their smaller parts for granted in order to get this problem going. But once you get it, and they're pretty plausible assumptions, it looks like it leads to the conclusion that there are billions of people right around you that share almost all your parts. All right, various ways to solve this problem. And the one that Hudd focuses on in his book that raises this worry for free will is, to me anyway, like one of the least attractive possible solutions, which is to accept the absurd conclusion and just to say, yep, there actually are billions of people where I am right now. But then to follow it up by saying, but it's okay because they overlap so significantly that for practical purposes, we can just say, we can call them one person. That's actually David Lewis's solution. Speaking of David Lewis, he's kind of all over the metaphysics literature. Anyway, what Hudd points to in the book is if that's the solution you go for, if you think there really just are billions of people where we think there's only one, then it looks like it raises a problem about free will because this massive overlap of parts between all these billions of people who are there in your neighborhood right now seems like any action taken by one of those overlapping people is going to entail or necessitate that you perform the exact same action. It's like those polygraph machines that Thomas Jefferson used, not the lie detector sort of polygraph, but the kind where he actually had a pen that he could write a letter with, and it was connected to another pen that was on top of a different piece of paper. And so he could make a copy of all the letters that he wrote and save them for himself. It's kind of like that, right? He's guiding one of the pens, but at the very same time, there's a duplicate pen that's being guided by or kind of being necessitated into writing the same letter so that he can keep a copy for it. So the idea is if this is the way human beings are, if there's billions of people kind of in our spot, then it looks like that makes our actions feel like they're sort of an automatic copy of some other person's actions. And that feels threatening to free will.
Yeah.
So that's one threat. Maybe let me say the other threat first, and then we'll come back and talk about both of them together. So here's the other threat. And this is, so erase everything I just said about overlapping people. This is a completely different idea.
Okay.
So this idea comes from thinking about mirrors. and the things that they reflect. So in our ordinary world, you look in a mirror, what you see is a two-dimensional reflection of a part of your three-dimensional body. The reflection itself has height and width, but it has no depth. Or we interpret it as though it has depth because of shading and light and so forth, but that's different from actually having depth. So it doesn't have any depth like you do. It just got width and height. Likewise, if we just suppose for a moment that a two-dimensional thing could get in front of a mirror. So if a two-dimensional square, for example, could be conscious and like moving around on the surface of a table or something, and if it could look into a mirror, what it would see is a one-dimensional reflection of a part of its two-dimensional body. What it would see in the mirror would just look like a line, a one-dimensional line, which has width, but neither height nor depth. Okay, so if that feels okay, then here's the next move. If three-dimensional bodies like ours create two-dimensional images in mirrors, then four-dimensional bodies, that is, bodies that extend into four dimensions of space, assuming that there could be four dimensions of space, those four-dimensional bodies would create three-dimensional images in mirrors. The mirror reflection that you cast is always one dimension fewer than whatever dimension your body is. So if there could be four-dimensional bodies, they would cast three-dimensional reflections. And so here's the horrifying metaphysical thought. Could you and I actually be reflections of four-dimensional beings who are moving around in front of their mirrors?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a bizarre thought, but it also seems to raise a worry for free will, because if you think about how a mirror reflection is related to the thing that casts the reflection, it's like the behavior of the reflection is completely determined by the movements of the person that's casting, or the thing that's casting the reflection. Right. So if we were three-dimensional mirror reflections of four-dimensional beings, then our movements would be completely determined, or at least so it seems, by the movements that the four-dimensional beings choose to make. And, you could just run the same worry for the four-dimensional beings too, who could themselves be reflections of five-dimensional beings. It looks like there's a lot of lack of free will in this kind of wild, far out.
Right.
Okay, that's super far out stuff, and you might think like, who cares? If that's your reaction, I totally understand it. But first of all, let me say, go read Hud Hudson's books. He does a lot of work to motivate the legitimacy of these metaphysical ideas. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'd also say, we're doing philosophy here, and I think philosophy, one of the great things about it is that you can learn things about the real world from exploring like the outer reaches of what's possible. Right. And anyway, in this case, so what Andrew Law and I argue in this paper is that thinking through these cases actually helps us to think through what free will involves in the real world. And so we try to make the case that there's a difference between these two worries, that the worry about overlapping people is different in a significant way from the worry about mirrors, because there's a difference between whether what we do is entailed by something on the one hand, and whether it's explained by something on the other. In the case of the overlapping people, it seems like at best what we get is an entailment, like an if-then statement. If my overlapping person does this, then I will do it too. But in the mirror case, we get more than just an if-then. We also get and what we do is explained by the movements of the thing that's casting the mirror image. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to free will, like even free will in the real world, I think what matters, or what should worry us anyway, is not simple entailment facts, but instead facts about explanation. Mm-hmm. So Andrew and I try to suggest in that paper that the mirror image case is more of a threat to free will than the overlapping people case is. And it mirrors, no pun intended, the difference between God's foreknowledge, the threat from God's foreknowledge, and the threat from causal determinism, whereas the threat from God's foreknowledge seems to be a mere matter of entailment. And so you might think it's actually less worrisome to free will than causal determinism, which seems to be not just entailment, but also some sort of explanatory threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
You've suggested in some of your work that one lesson we might draw from thinking about time travel and these other non-standard threats to free will is that we might do better to unlink free will from the ability to do otherwise. So could you describe this idea and say a bit more about how it might be developed?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to say something about this. I definitely don't have the details worked out here, but yeah, I can kind of sketch the basic idea. So go back to the Harry Potter case that we started with. We've already seen reasons to think that at the moment he's deciding to go back in time, the fact that he's in some sense already been back in time means that he can't opt out. He's not able to do otherwise than go back in time. So if free will involves the ability to do otherwise, what we have to say is he's not free to opt out. He doesn't exercise his free will when he goes back in time. But I think here's another natural thought. The usual situations that rob us of our free will are situations in which we're constrained or otherwise like prevented from making a choice or from doing whatever it is that we've chosen to do. So if Harry lacks free will about going back in time, what is it that's constraining him? Like, what's stopping him? What's weird about this sort of case, I think, is that it's nothing but his own choices that are constraining him. Mm-hmm. It'd be one thing if Hermione used the Imperio spell on him, which is a spell that allows you to control somebody else's body against their will, and then forced him to travel back in time. That really would seem like a case of no free will. He's constrained. He's not even kind of deliberating on his own. But in the actual case, as it's told, it's Harry who decides to go back in time. And it's only because he decides to go back in time that he's now in this predicament in the first place about deciding whether to go back in time. And if that's the setup, it seems like, well, why should that count as a lack of free will? I mean, we can do things to constrain ourselves. I can put handcuffs on myself and throw away the key or swallow the key or something, in which case I have done something myself to constrain myself. But that's not Harry's situation.
Right.
His situation is one where the consequences of his own choice, that is his adventures in the past, somehow end up robbing him of the ability to make a different choice to begin with. And okay, fine. Like maybe that's the way we have to think about abilities. Maybe it's true. Only things you're able to do, as Viveland suggests, are the things that you might succeed at doing if you had tried. And so Harry doesn't have the ability to opt out of going back in time. But it feels like a further step, at least to me, to make the inference that he therefore lacks free will, given that there's nothing outside of Harry himself that seems to be constraining what he does. So maybe another way to say it, even if there is a reasonable case to be made that Harry can't opt out of going back in time, mm-hmm. since he's already made the decision in some sense, it still seems like the decision to go back in time was up to him. Mm-hmm. It's true. It's entailed by facts about what his time traveling self did in the past, but there's nothing other than Harry himself that's explaining what he does. And it seems like, again, what usually causes worries about free will are cases where there's some sort of external force that's explaining what we do. Mm-hmm. So if you take free will to be a matter of an action's being up to you or up to me, if that's the basic notion of what free will involves, well, most theorists have just taken it for granted that an action is up to you only if you can refrain from performing it, only if you have the ability to do otherwise. But I think what these weird time traveling cases might show instead is those two things might come apart. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's actually a cool piece of dialogue, just to bring things full circle, in the Harry Potter story that I think is suggestive here. So he travels back in time. He saves himself with the Dementors. His friend Hermione is shocked by how he was able to cast the protective spell because it's really advanced magic, and he hadn't learned that yet in school. So she asks him about it, and he says, I knew I could do it this time because I'd already done it. Does that make sense? And in the movie version anyway, Hermione says no, which is a funny line. But I think it does make sense, right? So rather than making Harry feel powerless, his awareness of the logical connections between the different moments of his life actually like gives him confidence to do the thing in the first place. Could he have just sat idly by and watched his younger self die? Well, no, like he couldn't have done that because the way the story is all twisted on top of itself, that doesn't work. But none of those weird logical facts about what entails what seem to explain why he does what he does. It still seems to be something he freely chooses, to me anyway.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much, Neal. This has been a fascinating conversation. I love thinking about this stuff. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Thanks so much for having me, Taylor and Matt. I really appreciate it. It's been great. First, let me plug somebody else's work. So one of my colleagues here at Western, Ryan Wasserman, has published a fantastic book on paradoxes of time travel. It's just called Paradoxes of Time Travel. It's published with Oxford University Press. It came out a few years ago. And it's the go-to place for anyone interested in like the whole range of metaphysical questions here. He's got a couple chapters specifically about the paradoxes of freedom. He talks about the grandfather paradox at length in detail. So I've learned a lot from Ryan and from reading his book. I definitely encourage listeners to check that out.
Yeah, that's great.
As for my own work, I'm pretty easy to find. I've got a distinctive last name. So if you just Google me, you can be pretty sure that the Neal Tognazzini you find is going to be me. I've got a Phil Papers profile. I try to keep that updated, but like any academic who writes on obscure topics, I'm always happy to hear from people who are fascinated by this stuff. So if you want to email me, you can find my email address on my university profile page.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks again, Neal. In our next episode, we'll talk about the problem of blame, and our guest will be Kelly McCormick, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Texas Christian University.